Hello, back again. I thought I would do another video, not so much on philosophy, but on, literary, but with philosophical ramifications, and I will explain as I go along. John Keats died in 1821, maybe? Didn't live a long life, John Keats. One of my favourite all-time poets. In fact, I've been thinking recently, I think a good poet should always be... Somebody was saying you should never make lists of your favourite poets. You should never rank them. I always rank. I mean, if I don't write them down, I'm ranking them on a daily basis as spiritual, supernatural, textual examples of how to live and how to write. Could it be that learning how to write good poetry is totally ensconced and interchangeable with learning how to be a good person, whatever that might mean to Plato and others? Anyway, that's by the by. John Keats. I want to talk about John Keats today. It's linked up mildly, tenuously with my video on Charles Olson. Charles Olson was a fan of Keats, could I say? I'm not sure if that's too generalized. He did take this notion that I'm going to talk about today, and he talked about it, and I want to talk about it too. And it's Keats's notion of negative capability. And I'm going to do some reading today. This is about as techie as I get, which is I'm going to read from the internet while I'm talking to you. So I've got this up. It's just the Wikipedia version of negative capability. I don't have the original. Well, I may have the original sources somewhere. Anybody who's read Keats knows that negative capability comes out of one of his letters. In fact, it's repeated, or these collection of ideas are repeated in a number of letters. But at least with the Wikipedia page, we've got something fairly succinct to begin with. And then I'll try to extrapolate something from this idea. All right, let's just read the Wikipedia on negative capability, and then I will talk a little bit about it. This is for people who've probably already read John Keats or know some of his poetry. And if you haven't read his letters and only his poetry, I definitely recommend reading the letters. They're amazing letters. They're some of the best letters in all of literature. Actually, I'm all over the place today. Sorry, I talked about lists, making lists. Yeah, John Keats, very high on my list. In fact, my love of William Blake has perhaps been taken over a little bit by my love of John Keats. For many different reasons, which I'll go into in another video probably. Okay, negative capability was a phrase first used by Romantic poet John Keats in 1817 to characterize the capacity of the greatest writers, particularly Shakespeare, to pursue a vision of artistic beauty even when it leads them into intellectual confusion and uncertainty, as opposed to a preference for philosophical certainty over artistic beauty. The term has been used by poets and philosophers to describe the ability of the individual to perceive, think, and operate beyond any presupposition of a predetermined capacity of the human being. A separate section. This is how Keats actually framed it in the letter. Keats used the phrase only briefly in a private letter, and it became known only after his correspondence was collected and published. In a letter to his brothers, George and Thomas, on 22nd of December 1818, Keats described a conversation he had been engaged in a few days previously. Quote, "I had not a dispute, but a disquisition with Dilke upon various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability, that is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine, isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This, pursued through volumes, would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration." And Wikipedia goes on, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was, by 1817, a frequent target of criticism by the younger poets of Keats's generation, often ridiculed for his infatuation with German idealistic philosophy, which I'm going to make a video on because I think there's some new translations that I actually really like, but that's another thing. Against Coleridge's obsession with philosophical truth, Keats set up the model of Shakespeare, whose poetry articulated various points of view and never advocated a particular vision of truth. Keats's ideas here, as was usually the case in his letters, were expressed tersely with no effort to fully expound what he meant, but passages from other letters enlarge on the same theme. In a letter to J.H. Reynolds in February 1818, he wrote, "We hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us, and if we do not agree, seems to put its hand in its breeches pocket. Poetry should be great and unobtrusive, a thing which enters into one's soul and does not startle it or amaze it with itself, but with its subject." In another letter to Reynolds the following May, he contrived the metaphor of the chamber of maiden thought and the notion of the burden of mystery, which together express much the same idea as that of negative capability. I'll quote some of this, but it's a fairly long quote, so I'll just read until I think you've got the general gist of it. "I compare human life to a large mansion of many apartments, two of which I can only describe, the doors of the rest being as yet shut upon me. The first we step into we call the infant or thoughtless chamber, in which we remain as long as we do not think. We remain there a long while, and notwithstanding the doors of the second chamber remain wide open, showing a bright appearance. We care not to hasten to it, but are at length imperceptibly impelled by the awakening of the thinking principle within us. We no sooner get into the second chamber, which I shall call the chamber of maiden thought, than we become intoxicated with delight and the atmosphere. We see nothing but pleasant wonders and think of delaying there forever in delight. However, among the effects this breathing is farther off is that tremendous one of sharpening one's vision into the heart and nature of man, of convincing one's nerves that the world is full of misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness and oppression, whereby this chamber of maiden thought becomes gradually darkened, and at the same time on all sides of it many doors are set open, but all dark, all leading to dark passages." I think I'll finish this because it's interesting. "We see not the balance of good and evil. We are in a mist. We are now in that state. We feel the burden of the mystery. To this point was Wordsworth come, as far as I can conceive, when he wrote Tintern Abbey, and it seems to me that his genius is explorative of those dark passages. Now, if we live and go on thinking, we too shall explore them. He is a genius and superior to us. insofar as he can, more than we, make discoveries and shed a light in them. Here I must think Wordsworth is deeper than Milton. Wikipedia goes on, Keats understood Coleridge as searching for a single higher order truth or solution to the mysteries of the natural world. He went on to find the same fault in Dilke and Wordsworth. All these poets, he claimed, lacked objectivity and universality in their view of the human condition and the natural world. In each case, Keats found a mind which was a narrow private path, not a thoroughfare for all thoughts. Lacking for Keats were the central and indispensable qualities requisite for flexibility and openness to the world, or what he referred to as negative capability. The concept of negative capability is precisely a rejection of set philosophies and preconceived systems of nature. He demanded that the poet be receptive rather than searching for fact or reason, and to not seek absolute knowledge of every truth, mystery, or doubt. It is not known why Keats settled on the phrase negative capability, but some scholars have hypothesized that Keats was influenced in his studies of medicine and chemistry, and that it refers to the negative pole of an electric current which is passive and receptive, and I'd also suggest possibly more feminine. In the same way that the negative pole receives the current from the positive pole, the poet receives impulses from a world that is full of mystery and doubt, which cannot be explained, but which the poet can translate into art. And there's more to that on the Wikipedia page. I might come back to it, but we've got enough material there to be getting on with. First of all, while I was reading that, it reminded me of the Alan Watts quote in one of the audio recordings on YouTube that a lot of people have been getting interested in the last decade or so. He talks about this idea of when you're looking at something and somebody says, look at that, you instinctually try to look harder or more specifically than you would normally look. And it makes no sense to Alan Watts to do that, because you are not seeing more when you are straining your eyes like that. There's almost a bodily component to this negative capability, I'd suggest, in that if you take on a lot of the disciplines and ideas of the 20th century, it does dovetail a lot, and Zen is mentioned further down in that Wikipedia article. This idea of straining is kind of interesting. The problem with the older Romantic poets was that they had a more temporal sense of the problem. We have Wordsworth's idea of, what is it? I want to get this phrased correctly. There's a specific phrase Wordsworth used. It was notions collected in tranquility, or something like that. The idea that the poem comes out of a very visceral and immediate experience, possibly of a mystical nature, which is then written down after the fact. So Wordsworth is kind of implying the linearity of a composition of poetry, so that you have this experience and then after the fact you write it down, and hopefully you do it justice, and to one degree or another Wordsworth managed that, at least in some of his best poems. Keats is a little bit different, because he's talking about what is that immediate experience, and he's just focusing on the experience itself, not the process of composition or composing poetry. And I think that's a good end to look at it, because getting the poem down is simply a copy of getting the experience down in your mind. And if it be a mystical or semi-mysterious experience, all you need to do is replicate it in text. It also reminds me of, inevitably, and I'm hoping that some people have read Colin Wilson, because Colin Wilson did a lot of work on the peak experience and Abraham Maslow's notion of the peak experience from coming out of the 60s and 70s, I think, his research. And another thing, this time in poetry, Philip Lamantia's wonderful little phrase, which is much more obscure. Some people will have read it. He's not well known in Britain as much as he should be. There's a wonderful phrase from one of his poems, and I wish I could tell you where to find it. It's in the collected poems. But anyway, the first line of the poem is, the very thought of the poem kills it. So again, it's this problem of thought, and it's kind of introducing the idea of meditation. To get into a utterly receptive mode, not utterly, but at least partially receptive mode of experiencing the world and accepting mystery. So as you've already gathered, the problem with Coleridge is that he is and if you've read Coleridge's prose, you'll know he's kind of a philosopher, poet, as most people know. And Keats is saying, well, this isn't really good enough. This is another problem which I find interesting, and I introduced it into a poem of mine which has not been published like most poems of mine, but the poem was entitled Deep Autobiography. I was getting frustrated because I was a philosophy major, well, 25 years ago or whatever, and I've always read philosophy fairly regularly. What was I going to say? I've always also been a real reader of biographies. I used to read more than I do presently, but I read a lot of biography. I'm always interested in people's lives. And what frustrated me sometimes about reading philosophy, particularly philosophy translated from the German, and it could just be a laziness on my behalf, but I wanted to know the circumstances of their experience in which certain ideas were born in them, and thus they describe those ideas in philosophy. Now, why did I have that requirement of the philosophers I was studying? It seems to me that even unconsciously it could be a striving after the poetic, really, because especially if you read somebody like Heidegger, the fact that he venerates Hölderlin so massively is a corner of Heidegger's work that always fascinated me. I always find that philosophers are failed poets or failed artists in some ways, and you see that in Nietzsche as well. And I think that's the antagonism between Nietzsche and Wagner, by the way, if you've studied Nietzsche. Nietzsche got very pissed off with Wagner, and I won't get into that in any sense apart from this general statement that Nietzsche was a frustrated composer, and for a small portion of his life was obsessed with Wagner, who was the more creative individual, I'd say. It seems to me that all philosophy is dependent on the mystical or peak experience, and philosophy is an outcome of the human's attempt to get to grips with what that peak experience was. And when it's put into words, it provides a template for some form of spiritual instruction to the populace, and that this instruction has a sequence across the epochs which is intended theologically from, let's just call them outside sources. People talk about gods and guides, and the muse is the classical attempt at trying to find out where that information comes from. By Keats's time, we had lost the Elizabethan notion of the muses, and of course that was brought down from the classical time. But it was really, if you read some of Shakespeare and you read the writers of Shakespeare's time, the muse element is just a concrete thing. Everybody recognises it. It's It's a fascinating concept. I've talked about it in other videos, at least partially. But it's descended a little into when you get the Enlightenment, it's more about philosophy then, and philosophy is the remaining tool to get to grips with the informancy of the muse. Now that's not delineated in negative capability, in a sense, because Keats's negative capability is much more of a reaction against Coleridge. So he's not really talking about what he's for, he's talking about what he's against. And what he's against is Coleridge's, as he says, reaching after reason and fact, scientific fact, which I think is fascinating. And so then it begs the question, the best philosophy is the closest to the muse. And if you don't like the muse, you could say the gods, you could say the fairy folk, the invisible, the other ones, or whatever you want. Some of you might not like that because it's a bit of a twee, Celtic, twilighty notion. Joyce certainly didn't appreciate it very much. But nonetheless, there's something going on here about being in I'd say a positively confused state of mind. I think the negatively, I could confuse you even more, because this problem of the word negative. I think if you're studying Keats's version of negative capability, I would take that scientific explanation in Wikipedia a little bit more seriously. What I mean is culturally negative or positive. What I'm trying to do here is create an oppositorum between confusionism, which is the attempt to confuse people intentionally by reason, which I think is a cabal technique, and it's very much in the media a lot. That's not what I'm talking about. I think a positively charged confusion would be more spiritually inclined. It would be the other end of it, which is this sense of the mystical, possibly the gods, either of the classic era, the classic gods, or whatever personal gods you wish to imagine yourself as being in touch with. I know when I do the tarot cards, I name the decks bibliomantically after certain gods, using texts that I've read on gods, and for people who are into pantheism, you won't like all of that, but I find it useful personally. So whoever you want to appeal to, whether that be Zeus or whether it be Arethusa, which is one kind of muse figure in my poetry from the classical era, you can do whatever the hell you want with that. I may not use those templates for mystical appeal in the future. They've served me artistically up until this point. Whether they will do in the future, I don't know. The point being is still this Zen notion of the peak experience. And again, it just harks back to the video I just made, which was the one about filial piety on a tangent, where I was talking more about reincarnation. But anyway, what I'm getting at is the purism of this, because Keats is talking only about, and remember with Keats, the favourite phrase, which is, truth is beauty, beauty is truth kind of thing. I'll actually pick up my copy of Keats just to explain. A thing of beauty is a joy forever, its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. It's interesting. I do think he equates truth with beauty. Now, we're in a situation culturally whereby we are societally confused by the notion of absolute truth right now, because, as I said in the last video, we've got so much information that is coming into our consciousness that it's easy to be confused. But I think even on an internet level, technological level, there is a positive confusion element of being in doubts and involved with mysteries that is useful to us. And I'm also going to bring in a few translations from other cultures here. In Korean you have the word han, which is this state of being which could be a state of pain or yearning for something greater, spiritually beyond us. It's given a rather miserable sheen in a lot of modern explanations of what han is in the Korean. And I explained this in my online journal, The Fiend, many years ago, and I was glad that other people kind of took these ideas and used them for their own purposes. The other one is the Welsh called hireth, if I remember rightly, or hiret. I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm not a Welsh speaker, and I think you've already heard some of my terrible Welsh pronunciations. But again, it's a yearning for something beyond, and there are examples of this. There are words, I'm sure you could find words in every culture for the desire of the beyond and the attendant confusion or mystical agony that accompanies it. I'm not sure I want to add in agape, the Greek, because that's much more about love, unconditional, but it's not dissimilar either, so you know, take that for what it is. So that is the impulse, the poetic impulse, the idea that as much as philosophy will help you, it comes after the fact. And so again, I'm kind of, regardless of what my conceptual framework is I'm trying to build, I'm kind of I'm voting in to the idea of mysticism over philosophy and pure artistry. And I've found it personally very helpful over the last couple of years to be involved in busking. As if you've watched these videos, you already know. So I'm just involved in singing songs, whether they be mine or other people's, and I've been away from establishment academy structures for quite a while now, and I've just found it personally useful not to deal with philosophy too heavily. Now, I've said in other videos that doesn't constitute a recommendation for not studying philosophy, but in this process of artistry and of being a creative individual, it is that peak experience, that mystical experience, possibly Zen experience, that is the active function in your life, and that the philosophy is the outcropping of that. And I think, I hate to use Celtic because I'm going to do a video on that, but the Irish inheritance, I feel, is an understanding of the world being unconsciously created before the fact of the material world. That is something that's just in the genes of those people. They are not inherently a philosophical race of people. Now that's a big thing to unpack. We've got race, we've got the word Celt, which I don't like very much, because that's just a new phrase that's a few hundred years old, really. It does have correlatives in the ancient world, but they are very different. So I don't want to get too much into the racial element of it, but this let's not say anti-philosophical stance, but pre-philosophical stance, proto-mystical stance, is, I think, what Keats is getting at. I'm just going to see if I can grab any more from this piece on negative capability. I'm going to go down. You can, by all means, if you're watching this video, you can access this. It's easy to find on Wikipedia, and of course Wikipedia is not trustable in many ways, particularly on things of history, but here I think it's fairly benign. The last thing that caught my eye here was the last two pieces. Says, in the context of Zen, the notion of negative capability has been associated with Zen philosophy. Keats' man of negative capability had qualities that enabled him to lose his self-identity, his imaginative identification with and submission to things, and his power to achieve a unity with life. The Zen concept of Satori is the outcome of passivity and receptivity, culminating in sudden insight into the character of the real. Satori or Satori is reached without deliberate striving. The antecedent stages to Satori: quest, search, ripening, and explosion. The quest stage is accompanied by a strong feeling of uneasiness, resembling the capacity to practice negative capability, while the mind is in a state of uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts. In the explosive stage, akin to Keats's chief intensity, a man of negative capability affects a fellowship with essence. So that's the Zen connection. I'm not sure what to make of this last piece. Criticism. Stanley Fish has expressed strong reservations about the attempt to apply the concept of negative capability to social contexts. He criticized Unger's early work, and Unger is a theorist also in the article that I haven't read. He criticized Unger's early work as being unable to chart a route for the idea to pass into reality, which leaves history closed and the individual holding on to the concept while kicking against air. Fish finds the capability Unger invokes in his early works unimaginable and unmanufacturable, that can only be expressed outright in blatant speech or obliquely in concept. More generally, Fish finds the idea of radical culture as an oppositional ideal, in which context is continually refined or rejected, impracticable at best, and impossible at worst. Okay, fair enough. Is that of much use to me? I'm not sure. They are dilly-dallying around the same problem I've talked about, which is the problem of philosophy in relation to this peak experience, or Zen receptivity. And this is a tricky one, isn't it? Because we've got nationalism and we've got nationalist notions of identity, which is very much a reaction against neoliberalism. And in the political context, I would have a patience and an interest in that debate on the social level. But any political or social shenanigans and commentary you get up to, I always find is, again, downstream from the mystical experience, and the idea of negative capability that Keats is trying to talk about here. I noticed a few years ago when Richard Spencer was very much doing the rounds of people who were interested in the alt-right, or whatever that phrase might mean to people. And I'm a person that kind of involves myself in every little stream of cultural debate that goes on. I hope I am anyway. I'm trying to be, without being affixed to any one school. And I think that's another thing with the poet, is that this process of negative capability doesn't really, can't really attach itself to things like what I'm getting at is that I did watch one particular video of Richard Spencer having grabbed hold of a specific artist who he liked, whose work fitted the template of what he envisioned politically for the Western world. Spencer, I mean. And I was immediately disappointed by the poem or whatever it was that the person read. And again, it's this essential problem of fitting an artistic production to a political template. It never works. It never did. And even if you were really into far right templates and you wanted to preserve, i.e. fascism or Nazism, as a template to construct a new conservative socio-political model, you're immediately struck by the fact that the artworks from that period are disappointing. So that, again, the political aspect can never impose itself or contribute to this more inspirational and mystical example of negative capability. It just doesn't work that way, and it's why, you know, the phrase, you know, all works of art are useless, in some sense, has gained ground over the last 100 years or so. And I don't think that's going to go anywhere anytime soon. It's this sense of surrendering yourself up to the unknown. And of course, and that's the kind of deliverance from one's own thought streams. It's even got meditation implied there somewhere. The idea of the empty mind, or the mind not reigned by, you know, cognitive thought. So Keats is very much interested in that process, way beyond what other contemporaries were imagining at the time. So the letters are wonderful, and I've always had a problem with poets' letters and stuff. There aren't many letters of poets that are really great. I think I've already said Joyce's letters are incredibly dull for some reason. They're very practical and they don't really tell us. I mean, everything in Joyce is in the writing. Everything else is pretty mundane, as far as I can tell. Keats is not like that. Hart Crane is not like that. If you read their letters, they're really good, really good. I mean, not all of Hart Crane's letters, but a lot of them are just really, really interesting and should be read a hell of a lot more. Little bit with Rilke, but you know, I could do a video on poets' letters at another time. But it is useful here, obviously, because it comes out of the letters, this negative capability. I don't think the phrasing of this helps very much, to be honest. But there you go. This irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge was lucky from a 21st century perspective, as far as I can tell, because even though you might find a lot of the German philosophy that he talks about dry and boring, I don't think so. If you search around properly in there, you're going to find Schelling, who I think is absolutely fascinating, and they've just translated a lot of Schelling's work into English really for the first time, and get on it if you have the money. I mean, it was going to cost you 20 quid a book. I don't have that money, but I know that Michael Tsarian has done some work on Schelling, if I'm not mistaken, and he's the best as far as I've read into little pieces of these guys, you know, the other people involved. But Schelling to me is Fichte, of course, is one of the other ones, and Hölderlin is tangentially connected with that group of people. But Schelling is a giant of a philosopher, and I think it was him that Coleridge was accused of plagiarizing. But what a guy to plagiarize from, if you're going to pick. I mean, you don't want to be plagiarizing from some idiot philosopher who doesn't know very much. If that's true, I can't remember if that's absolutely the case. So the Romantics had generally good taste in philosophy compared to nowadays, if they're interested in philosophy at all. That's one thing I love about the earlier post-war American poets like Olson and Duncan. That's why they are my teachers in some sense, because they seem grounded in philosophy, and that they're asking big questions, and their poetry is involved in that process. I don't get that impression from most 21st century poets that have been published. There are probably unknown poets out there who are impelled to ask the big questions as a result of what they're composing in terms of poetry. That's great. I mean, obviously it's abstract because we don't have these poets available to us in a published form. Okay, so that's that. Poetry as opposed to philosophy, and poetry as instinctually involved in a mystical, possibly peak experience along the Colin Wilson line of thought. The other thing that I wanted to mention before I finish this talk is Zen Satori and the beats. When I was reading that piece, that little section about Satori, I don't know how to pronounce it, it reminded me of this debate that was going on within the beats. Neither writer I'm going to mention here I have much respect for anymore, but it's there, and it's in Kerouac, and it's in Ginsberg, and I've already mentioned Lamantia, who's obviously connected here with his the very thought of a poem kills it, because you have the first thought, best thought. So you've got other approaches to this problem of how to put into text the mystical or proto-mystical peak experience. Ginsberg's solution to that is first thought, best thought, uncalculated. It's the thought stream. It could almost be the Joycean Finnegan's Wake thought stream, or even relate to Whitman's "okay, I contradict myself," that kind of thing. What we find fascinating and incredibly annoying about ourselves is that we contradict ourselves within thought. I've even a 1 hour, 2 hour talk that I've given online here, I'll throw in bits where I'll be like, there was an example from one of the other talks where I'm like, that doesn't fit in with my general picture for the arts in Korea. And I think later on I said, well, I did this artist residency anyway, so that means that they exist. But do you know what I mean? Like, you find yourself arguing against yourself regardless. I mean, so this is this sense of, I'm building an identity and I want you to be persuaded by it. And then, of course, your thought streams kill it, because you can't follow one template. And again, I guess this is the argument against absolute truth. Truth is found in lots of different places, and it contradicts it. In arriving at it, if you imagine it as a journey towards truth, that journey is crooked and windy. The William Blake quote. It's not a straight path. So the conceptual avenue, the philosophical thought stream, is not the one to trust. It's the windy, self-contradictory path, which is a lot more frustrating and a lot more dark night of the soul kind of thing. It's a spiritual reaching for the beyond. So let me just get back to that thing of first thought, best thought. What happened with Joyce so that we have Finnegan's Wake? There was not anything that Joyce explicated in his letters to show you how he got to that language. Whether you like the book or not, this is not a question of whether you like Finnegan's Wake or not. But the point is that somewhere in that stream of consciousness, and people can go back to Virginia Woolf and you get all that classic academic criticism of who invented the stream of consciousness. That's beside the point. The point is that thought stream, that approach to get deeper and deeper into what I would call the voice of silence, the unconscious voice, which psychoanalysis possibly attempted to explicate without knowing that these things had happened in the arts earlier to themselves. Whether Jung was avidly reading Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man is a totally separate problem. So they in some essence, from another point in European culture, are explaining what Joyce is doing without knowing what he's doing. Okay? First thought, best thought. Now, does that relate to Joyce, though? I mean, I've made a presumption there. Okay? I would say it does, in a way. And it's about this sense of all guardianship of what one thinks as a system needs to be pulled down. And some people do it through meditation. Some people, smoke DMT to do that, but it has to come down. So the unconscious process, before the thought of the poem, to use Lamantia's phrase, is the poem. And it's, again, it's a contradiction, right? Because if you try to not think, you have not think as a word. That's the other question, is does language come before thought even? And then you say, because I've done this in meditation and we all do it, and you say stop that. You say to yourself stop that, and you're doing it in language, and there's an intention and a meaning behind that self-thought one has, reflecting to oneself in one's own inner dialogue. So first thought, best thought. Now, so insofar as you're in time, you're living in time, there's loads of approaches to that. What is a first thought? It's all first thought, because you're generating material out from yourself, and then you look at it, and that's your first thought about what you just wrote. But that's also originary in some way too, so it's very complex, right? The Beats tried to simplify it a little bit, and whether their procedure matched, their explicit sense of what they were doing matched what they actually were doing, is debatable. And perhaps they simplified it for themselves in order to promote the idea more widely. But again, it does kind of adhere to a pre-philosophical mode of creation, which is interesting. And then you say, this is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. But in the act of creation, you don't know why you're doing it, and you can't explain it. Take any Bob Dylan interview from the mid-60s and you'll get the same sense. Whether you like Dylan or not is another question. So you get that, don't you? Which is interesting. To do something without knowing what you're doing. And then society falls way, way back in the distance. They try to monetize it in the form of, you have produced books, you monetize them, you promote them, all the rest of it. That's way in the wake, hanging way, way back on the coattails of this experience that I'm talking about, of negative capability. The originary source is to be in a mode of vague receptivity without reaching after anything. Isn't it interesting that we have a history which runs on linear lines, which is perpetually informed by the non-linear, by the mystical, by the goddess, muse aspect, invisible aspect of life? I always find that perpetually interesting, and I think it's something that Robert Duncan found perpetually interesting, and possibly somebody like Henri Bergson or many of these philosophers who had grabbed hold of this idea but were still ensconced in the explanatory sense of it in terms of philosophy. If you, and I've talked about this in other videos, I've talked about that idea of, missing a loved one. Do you miss them for their ideas? I think you do. You can do, and fair play to you if you do. And that's absolutely an aspect of who they are. Even though I never met Coleridge, I miss him because I know him through his writing, and I can miss that person. But I miss a dead relative in a different way than I do that person. Some people you revere more for their ideas, other people simply as a physical presence. Physical presence, and you can hierarchize these however you want. But my point is that if you're creating something, you have to get close to your presence anyway. What is your presence? A person's presence. It is not ideological. It is not philosophical in its origin. And to access that is the purity of poetic composition and other artistic disciplines, but in this, in terms of my videos, this is what I'm more focused on. So I think that is the importance of negative capability. And of course, it's not, because it's not, it doesn't explain itself to any degree adequately in one's mind, because if you don't know what you're doing, how can you explain it to yourself, never mind anybody else? Because it doesn't do that, it has that similar quality of, abstract art, or how could this be art, because it's like a 7-year-old made it or something like that. The problem is, I don't like a lot of modern art, and I could easily fall into that category of dismissing art for those reasons. But I think it's becoming increasingly complex in the 21st century, what we deal with as good and bad art, because what is happening is an utter stratification of individuality back to that experience of negative capability, so that each member of society, in the Western sensibility at least, is becoming more and more and more themselves individually. And what does that mean? It means that they're becoming more and more and more different than each other individual, or if we're just talking about art, other artists. And so then the audience, the witness to that fruition of art, is becoming quite confused by all of these options that we have in front of ourselves. We're on the conspiracy angle. What has happened is that we've been shepherded into a sensibility under this cabal, right? Just for people who are interested in that. And so everything is quite predictable. But once we are released from that slavery, and I do think it's kind of happening to one degree or another right now, and has been possibly for quite a while, either beknownst to us or unbeknownst to us. What it means is, okay, just a test for anybody who does do a lot of alternate research, is open to lots of ideas, whether it's flat earth cosmology, whether it's Masonic symbolism, all of these different topics, down to just your conventional people who write about myth and philosophy and all the rest of it. Don't you think it's fascinating that the people who don't access that think very alike? They are cookie cutter people, but that the alternate research community, if you want to call it that, is perpetually arguing against itself, because there's so many very much more distinct theories about life, however you want to characterize that. And so it seems to me that if this slavery breaks down, what you are going to see, and this is not so much a construction that the cabal has made, obviously they intend a certain amount of social isolation, which is not good. But in the realm of art, each artist is going to become more and more and more themselves, and more and more and more and more informed by this process of negative capability, by not particularly knowing where you're getting it from. If you follow the diktats of the soul that is beyond the material world, which I think Joyce, unbeknownst to himself, did, you get closer to the presence of the soul embodied in the physical world. And when you do that, you are identified as very distant from someone else who has another way of producing art. So what I'm saying is that all of these artists are going to be very, very, very different from each other once released from this collectivist sensibility. And I know we live in this supposed free democracy where everyone can follow their muse and stuff like that, but it's not really the case, is it? Particularly in art, there is a sensibility that drives sanctioned poetry in Britain. whether you like it or not. And that's fine, and it will produce what it has to produce, and I don't really have much personal problems with those people insofar as I would wish them any harm, but I wouldn't necessarily read what they're doing. So I'm muddying the waters slightly here, but I guess what I'm saying is that artists and individuals in general are going to become more and more and more themselves and less directly influenced by those of those others. So what it will do is render up a kind of crisis in the audience, and perhaps it already has done with modern art to a degree. I already talked about the anecdote about playing surrealist videos to a Korean audience that aren't spiritually prepared for that kind of thing. I mean, I think it was in Shan Andalou, right? It will do nothing for them because they're not ready for it. And yet, if you are evolved to a certain degree, you might get something. Or you might just say it's degenerate garbage, and you're quite free to do that as well. But the point still stands, is that if you follow the negative capability process, which means following the diktats of your soul, your spirit, it seems to me that the inevitable outcome of that is an increasing variety of artistic production, which bears no relation or less relation to other forms of art. What you're essentially saying is you've got an explosion of possibly visionary art. Now, on the historical level, you're still not gonna you're not going to expect that a large proportion of the population is going to be an artist of that caliber. And of course, material scientific worldviews will do everything to keep that sensibility out of consideration culturally. But don't you think it's interesting that if you study the history of literature, and I've already said that literature is dependent on bardism, or shamanism to some degree, when you study it, have you not noticed this? I'm sure most people have. Early death and exile seems to be a great theme of really great writers, and really great writers take longer to have a grip on the mainstream view of art by society in general. Good example, which I always go on about, I don't know if I've mentioned it here before, P.B. Shelley died in early 1820s, just after, no, was it as late as 1830? I don't know, you tell me. We still don't have a copy of Shelley's poetry in the way that he wrote it. We don't have a really good, well-presented chronological copy of Shelley. Now we're 200 years after the guy died, right? You would think we'd have sorted that out, right? Shakespeare, it's not until Coleridge and the Romantics that they start reading Shakespeare's sonnets. 200 years, right? Almost 200 years. Isn't it interesting, if you do a study of art and the way we receive certain artworks, you would probably agree with me that the best stuff takes the longest to be acknowledged. Now that says something for the inexplicable. It says something about the process of negative capability, the process of being immediately ensconced in mystery and wonder without knowing what it meant. In the same way, in the material world, we manifest the same problems. It takes us ages on a linear level, on a historical level, to get our heads round the best stuff. Isn't that interesting that happens? And if we can't get our heads around the same stuff, it will be produced and then hounded. So Dante's exile, Ovid's exile, Chaucer's possible murder, the fact that Shakespeare could have been a guy called Edward de Vere, or there are other candidates. Doesn't that fascinate you? That we impose the greatest strictures on the greatest stuff, and that is because we inhibit instinctually the inexplicable negative capability. So materially we are busy fighting the inexplicable, and this is almost a theory of physics, I would say. This inhibition, this group inhibition of the best stuff. Ezra Pound, escape. And also there's another element to this, there's a geographical element. D.H. Lawrence gets read in other places first, and sometimes published in other places before his own country. There's almost an element of this which is geographical too. The genius is accepted abroad, and where they are takes the longest. There's almost like I almost conceive it in a pictorial way. It's like a book is like a bomb, and it fruits out from, say, Newcastle or Dublin, and it's picked up. I'm saying a book. This is not a good analogy. A person, okay? They're born there. You could say Joyce for Dublin or something. And it takes Dublin the longest to get to grips with what that person born in Dublin was doing, or Lawrence was loathed in where he was from, and the bomb of the personality and their attendant artworks reaches the furthest shores of that language first. Obviously they have to be intelligent to readers of that language, and then goes back inward to where that person was born. Does that make sense? I know it's pretty abstract, but it's an interesting way of looking at it as well. And again, it says a lot for this kind of negative capability of a spirit born into the world. They have a certain amount of knowledge. They are drawn to the experience of the mystical via Keats's theorem, and then society has to come to grips with that. And sometimes it takes hundreds of years, sometimes it takes 2. And isn't it always the case that the shoutiest, most unspiritual, unmuse-like poets are the ones that are most accepted in their lifetimes, often within a few years of that book coming out, and then nada, niente, within 50? Isn't that an interesting process to reflect on? And in the genius is the opposite. Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound it can never flourish until its stock is in the ground. There are lots of collected cliches around that problem, and it's interesting. So the mystical experience is not is very antipathetic to the material linearity of history, and yet it is where all is born from. So a lot of abstractions to deal with towards the end of what I'm saying, but I find that interesting. I mean, I would like to think, and we all would like to imagine, a perfect world whereby, Vincent van Gogh grows up and he's a millionaire by the time he's in his late 20s or something. But it won't ever work out that way, to my view of the world, because the suffering attendant to those ignoring that artist contributes to the greatness of that art, because they have to struggle 100 times more than the poet who is writing postcard type greetings cards for a mass audience. It doesn't seem that there will ever be a perfect world or a utopia in which that interrelationship can be resolved. Politically and culturally, yes, we can make it easier for artists to have the time to produce artworks, but unfortunately government will always impede it for much of the time, simply because the artist can never explain what the muse wants, or whatever that informancy produces, in a linear, philosophical, explicable fashion. So it will always be, even if we provide for, if we say, okay, let's do the universal basic income, let's give it, if you don't want to work, okay, you live, we'll give you £1,000 anyway a month, and hopefully you can raise rent and groceries and do what you need to do to let the negative capability take hold. In a vague sense, that might be useful. I'm not sure what I think of the universal basic income. I was just looking at something of Giorgiani's, Jason Reza Giorgiani's video on possibly allowing some of that. I'm kind of traditional in a sense in that I'm not sure how that would work out. I think the market and local business kind of has to deal with more general societal prejudices to some degree, and that we shouldn't be dependent on the government. Now, if we can acquiesce to the idea that the printing of money is a magic trick, and that we just accept that, and then we say, okay, well, it's a magic trick, well, let's use that magic trick towards our advantage, rather than keeping it occulted and sequestered and then just filtering out money to the most spiritually idiotic members of the world. Maybe we can do something with that. I don't know how that could be structured in the future. I do think we can give people time, artists time, to let that process take hold of them. But if it's a case of applying for a grant with some specific temporal end in mind within the next year or two, you're always going to be on a loser with negative capability, because you'll never be able to define what it is you're doing, even to yourself, never mind to anybody else. And the muse will resist our appeals on the material realm, because it doesn't give a toss about what we throw money at. It has other things going on. So I've talked a lot about the different ramifications for that. I could go on and talk about how philosophy deals with that. Does it deal directly with that process or not? And do some cultures deal with it better than others? I think my instinct would be to say the West deals with it better than certain other cultures. But I think that would be more of a socio-political talk, and I just wanted this to be about Keats and negative capability. So I'll leave it at that on the level of the arts. Make of it what you will. I hope you'll use Keats's negative capability as a freeing aspect for whatever inventions you wish to manifest in your life, because I think it is quite a useful concept that struck Keats at that time. And I won't go so far as to say he's my favourite of the Romantic poets. He could be. I think certain poems that he wrote are perhaps the best of that era. I could build an argument for that. I'm not sure I want to. We'll see what happens with other talks. But I hope you got something from that anyway, because I think negative capability is a fascinating idea. Okay, I'll love you and leave you. Take care. Bye.